Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me in our silent? I'm getting nods. Excellent. I can't hear myself, so I just need to make sure this is actually working. There we go. Great. Great. Welcome, everyone, to our afternoon panel, How Can We Fight the Erosion of Rights in Our Global Landscape? I think a huge question to be asking here at the Paris Peace Forum in a particularly difficult moment in our global era. I'm thrilled to have a distinguished panel that will be answering this big question today. I thought I would just start off by reminding us of a few things. First of all, we have to remember that this was the location for the signing 75 years ago of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A moment of progress in our time that I feel like we all probably agree that we are not today living up to. 75 years later, the picture is bleak. We see conflict on the rise. We see division and polarization increasing. According to the European Union's Democracy Index of 2023, 8% of the global population live in a full democracy, and 40% live in authoritarian contexts. The norms that we all may have assumed have progressed are being challenged, and we have to recognize that the concept of linear progress is simply not the world that we live in today. And so we must ask the questions, are our multilateral systems fit for purpose in this global moment? Where have we gone wrong? I've been in so many discussions over the last years where we've been thinking about these questions and decrying the challenges that we face, but I think maybe not quite enough taking stock critically about where we went wrong, about recognizing the double standards that confront us over and over again around the world, the deficit of trust that we have among one another, and the failure to deliver on some of the core human rights commitments of that declaration 75 years ago. Before I turn to my amazing panel, I just did want to reflect on another speaker from the Paris Peace Forum last year. Maria Ressa was speaking in one of the sessions, and she said to us that we need to, as we stand in the rubble of the world that was, create the world that we want to live in. That has really been sitting in my mind over this last year. The need to both recognize that there is rubble around us, and that we have to face that squarely and with humanity, but also with determination of how we do build together the world that we want to live in. So as we do that, I'm really excited to have a distinguished panel in front of us who will try to answer some of these questions. I'll introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to ask each of them to open with a few reflections on the current state of where we are at before we hopefully are able to move to a discussion of some solutions and some spaces where we are seeing progress being made. To my direct left, Kelly Razouk is the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Democracy and Human Rights at the White House. Kelly, welcome. I know, Kelly, you're just off a plane, so thank you so much for fighting your jet lag to be with us as well. We appreciate it. Next to Kelly, we have Bruno Fuchs, President, Commission on Foreign Affairs of the National Assembly of the French Republic. Bienvenue et merci d'être ici. Next to Bruno, Patricia Shetty, the founder and president of She Says, president of the steering committee of the Paris Peace Forum. So I know you all know Tricia well. Tricia, thank you for being with us on the panel. So Tricia, I may actually begin with you, if I may, to set the scene, the troubling scene in which we find ourselves as we think about how we can advance a multilateral system that genuinely addresses the human rights challenges that we face today. Over to you.
Just in the beginning, for context, I'm speaking not representing the Paris Peace Forum right now when I'm speaking on this panel, more so as an activist and the work that I do in India and for democracy. I think it's important that we ask the question, human rights for whom, right? Because... Oh, c'est là, en fait. Je suis désolée. It's important that we ask the question, human rights for whom? And I'll tell you why I'm saying this. Because there's the latest UN report that came out that said nearly 70% of people killed in Gaza are women and children, out of which the largest population of victims are children aged 5 to 9. 5 to 9. 80% of the verified deaths have happened in residential buildings. And in contrast, what you saw on the 15th of October is Miller, the spokesperson of the US State Department, when questioned on the death of the 19-year-old Shaban al-Dua, who was burnt alive, and a reporter very bravely asked, how many more? He said, yes, Israel needs to minimize casualties, but also we need to talk about the question of Hamas hiding behind human shields, right? So what you see is there is not enough value being given for human rights, and that is the truth. We cannot have a conversation, honestly, about how do we protect and defend human rights if we're not accounting for the various lives that we are minimizing and not acknowledging as even humans who deserve access to rights. As an Indian, I'll tell you this. We see a lot of mobilization. The first Trump presidency, there was a lot of mobilization. The European Union was terrified of what is happening. There was conversations happening here as to how the European Union can no more rely on America's leadership. And now with his presidency again, there's concern. Everywhere I'm walking, people are asking me, are you concerned? The truth is, I've been concerned for the past 10 years as an Indian. Why am I saying this? Our Prime Minister was not allowed to enter United States of America. His visa was revoked because he was recognized as someone who had caused particularly severe violations of religious freedom, and therefore, under the Immigration and Security Act, he was considered as someone that America would not give a visa to. There was also a visa ban on our Prime Minister across the European Union. Fast forward track to when he's become Prime Minister, last year, we saw a Prime Minister get a state dinner in America. We saw him address Congress. He came here as the chef d'honneur for the Jeu de Bastille. Now I understand why working with India is important because of, you know, the politics of Russia and China. I understand why it's important in terms of trade and technology as well. But what is the message you are sending to our people when you go out of our way to sanitize the image of one leader, but then expect us to be concerned about another authoritarian leader who's come into power right now? The truth is you will lose people in the global south if you don't recognize that you are failing people from the global south by constantly minimizing the violations of atrocities, human rights that's happening in our territory, but then expect us to be concerned about what's happening here. And finally, I will summate with, if you're concerned about what's happening here, remember that all these experiments of debasing democracy, debasing human rights starts in the global south. We are recognized as the petri dish to, you know, when be it information, disinformation, Facebook interference on elections, anything, freedom of press, big concerns right now of will Trump go after his political opponents. You've already been seen that happening. You referenced Maria Ressa. She spoke about Facebook interference on elections way before Cambridge Analytica and Brexit. She kept raising concern about it because of what was happening in the Philippines. Sadly, tragically, we did not pay attention to that. Any problem that you see right now happening across the European Union, happening across America, it started in the global south. The experiments were perfected there and then exported here. So, you know, we need to have honest conversations.
Thank you, Tricia. I think the question I have, and maybe I'll pose it for Bruno to take up as he reflects on his thoughts on the current context, is how do we have those honest conversations? And is the multilateral space a space where we can have those? And if not, what kind of innovations do we need in order to engage constructively? À vous.
Alors, merci de votre question. Je vais m'exprimer en français.
Thank you so much for your question. I'll speak French if that's okay. And also, thank you for painting the picture so effectively. It's a key issue, has been a key issue from time immemorial. But this topic is even more, this issue is even more topical now than it was a couple of years ago. Globalization, deconstruction thereof. All of those phenomena that are taking place across the world, particularly in Europe since the end of World War II. We've been trying to build a world in which multilateralism and cooperation and the rule of law hold sway. We've created governance institutions to organize a world governance system. We've created the UN and NATO and WTO. We've created agencies to promote governance in the areas of culture, and healthcare. Regulations, rules, all of that world is being transformed into a space where we're seeing nation states are on the rise. We have strong authoritarian leaders gaining ground, and Donald Trump is not the only one. And this has hardened that international governance system and all those regulations that are trying to move the world towards more peace, more wisdom, more respect for human rights. So how do we respond to this? A number of initiatives have been taken, chief among which, and I agree with you on this, civil societies, when you're dealing with failing states, when states try to pit individuals against each other and try to fuel tensions and divisions, it is important for civil society to respond differently. Otherwise, human rights will be trampled further. Civil societies absolutely must express the fact that they disagree. Lawmakers are already intervening. They could do more, but it is important for citizens themselves to step up to the plate, so to speak. We can see that growing deregulation around the world means more violence and a stronger focus on the trial of strength. And growing violence will replace peace. Rising conflict, rising death toll, whether in the U.S. or elsewhere. Look at abortion and reproductive rights of women being trampled in the U.S. Now, maybe later we'll discuss to what extent or how we can get organized as citizens to ramp up the pressure on governance. Now, getting back to the issue of India, yes, a number of governments will express their national preference, some sort of protectionism. We all know heads of state and government who have that philosophy. And this means that we need new forms of cooperation. We need a new multilateral system. We need to work together with nations who want to project themselves into the world that we live in, Panama, Morocco, you name it. Maybe, well, in the past, we were forced to organize ourselves geographically. In France, for example, we had to deal with our closest neighbors, the Germans, the Spaniards, the Italians. How about a multilateral system with allies that we choose, even further afield? That way, we can let go of the constraint of geography, because virtual technology means we can choose our friends and allies across the world. We can choose who we cooperate with. We can select those countries that we agree on when it comes to the rules that regulate how we live. Thank you.
Bruno, thank you for setting that stage. And I think your points on the agency of civil society and citizens is one that we certainly want to return to. I would say, however, that as we think about how we advance these issues around the world, we have to think critically about how we are engaging to support citizens and civil society in ways that they want to be supported rather than ways that we might think that we want to support them. You also mentioned about the changing nature of the multilateral system. And so, Kelly, I may ask you to come in specifically on some of these questions around the need to radically reframe the multilateral system and how we can advance genuine reforms in this moment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Meredith, and it's an honor to be on this panel with such esteemed panelists and with you. As Tricia said at the outset, I think for human rights to mean anything, they have to apply to everyone. And that really is the basis for what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights set up 75 years ago. These fundamental rights should apply to anyone. The right to education, for the rights that my daughters have growing up in the United States, should be the same for every child growing up. And these protections should apply no matter where you are and no matter who you are. And I think that is a fundamental point, and it really hits home being here, where the UDHR was signed, as you mentioned. I think to your point about multilateralism and the state of some of our multilateral institutions, I think on the one hand you have people saying the UN is useless, the UN needs to be replaced, the UN is not accomplishing its goals. I would argue that while the UN and some of these multilateral institutions are imperfect, they are our best chance at achieving some of these goals that we've set out for ourselves. I think the multilateral system has done a lot when you look at things like vaccines for children, when you look at rallying the global community around humanitarian aid and things like that, that I don't think could be accomplished without the UN and without a strong UN. That said, I think the voices of the global South are missing from a lot of these conversations, and I think that was another point that was raised. I think when it comes to things like the UN Security Council, where a lot of decisions are made, the United States has put forward a proposal for reforming the UN Security Council to make sure that voices from other continents are represented on that body. And I think that's also something that would strengthen those institutions further, and I think would allow for greater discussions and greater voices on some of these consequential decisions that are being made.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm going to circle back around for a sort of a quick follow-up before we get into a question of solutions. We did sort of say to the panelists that we want to end on these are some things that can be done. So we're going to hold that just for a minute and maybe circle back around one more time for a few further reflections. And I'm particularly interested in maybe picking up on Bruno's point around civil society and citizens' agency. We talk a lot in the Paris Peace Forum. There is a need for big global cooperation on big issues, but global cooperation, we are made up of our citizens and our citizenry. And I think we see over and over again the extraordinary agency of social movements that don't always look like what we imagine government organization or organized civil society to look like in the same way. There are innovative ways that citizens are mobilizing, but at the same time, this is a time where human rights defenders are under some of the greatest threats of our time, and not only in some of the issues that have been spoken about already at the Paris Peace Forum. We've talked about Israel and Palestine, we've talked about Ukraine, but we haven't talked about Colombia. We haven't talked about a range of other places where human rights defenders are under massive, massive threat. So I wonder, Tricia, if you might say a word or two to kick us off around how do we engage and genuinely support citizens in their societies in ways that they need to be supported to advance their human rights on the ground.
You know, the truth is, we couldn't have a Greta Thunberg in the global south who would be hailed and lauded as a hero, which she rightfully is. She mobilized hundreds and thousands of people to recognize what a crisis the climate crisis is. Let's talk about the JTP, right? Bruno would know this well, Kelly would know this well as well. There was a lot of resource mobilization that happened where countries came together, leadership from America, from the EU, incredible, to give countries, developing countries, money and resources to become carbon neutral. 15.8 billion was allocated to Vietnam under the JTP, Just Energy Transition Program Plan. You know what Vietnam did? Around the same time they took that amount of money, they arrested their top climate activists. Hong, who's a dear friend, is an Obama Foundation scholar. That's how I know her. She just got released a few weeks ago after spending over a year incarcerated. Why? Because she was a climate activist. And that's how Vietnam thought they're going to make sure that they have a just energy transition program, by arresting activists. When President Obama made a remark on CNN, just before Modi's presidential prime minister visit to America, President Obama said, if I was President Biden, I would question Modi on Muslim rights, because it's a very real concern right now in India. Do you know what followed? The chief minister, one of the heads of our states, put out a tweet that said, there are many Hussein Obamas in India. Our police should prioritize taking care of them before going to DC. Imagine the tenacity, the shamelessness, and the audacity of a chief minister to openly threaten President Obama. And I'm giving you this context because if they're going after, they can openly threaten them. Imagine what they're doing to activists on ground in our country. So thank you for having these conversations about how do we protect the lives on ground, because the problem is, you know, we must recognize this is a highly sanitized space and setting, but very often the human rights defenders on the front lines are not just putting their bodies and mental sanity at risk, they're being actively targeted. At best, they're being imprisoned. At worst, they're being killed. So you cannot have any serious conversation about furthering human rights without first protecting the frontline defenders. And I don't want to hear anymore about how, diplomacy, you need more honeys, or you need more bees to attract honeys, we need everyone to come to the table. That's important, that's great. No way am I saying alienate India. There's no serious conversation that can happen about development without including India in the conversation, without including Global South. But what I think we need to do is not sanitize the image of world leaders who are actively involved in human rights violations. I think we need to protect human rights defenders on the front line and be very particular about where the money is going when you're allocating funds. And let me just say, the reason I'm saying this, India has lost 21 positions in the Freedom of Press Index over the last 10 years. The top 10 countries are all European Union countries. It is not lost on me the significance of where I'm standing here, a European Union that's based on values that we're actually seeing happen in practice, where press is actually free here. France has an initiative called Marianne, where they actually support activists to relocate and provide them support. That's the kind of support that we need if we're serious about protecting human rights.
Thank you, Tricia. I think, Bruno, directly over to you with that French example.
Alors, oui, je vais donner deux sentiments, puis après donner quelques exemples.
I'm going to add two comments, and then I'm going to give you some examples of what we are doing as parliamentarians. Now, indeed, I share this deep concern regarding the erosion of human rights around the world, because some states are failing, some states, through their relationships with each other, are actually creating further human rights violations as well. But a point of optimism, when you are in a multilateral model that defends the rule of law and human rights, then that model is the best model out there. Whether you're a citizen in North Korea, Colombia, China, Russia, India, or France, or the United States, of course, as well, then you have the right to express yourself freely. And so this model is attractive, and it needs to be implemented, and its implementation needs to be continued in the face of a growing number of players that are trying to hinder its implementation. So how do we go about doing that? Well, a few ideas. Now, I've talked about a new form of multilateralism, and today I'm also at the head of the Parliamentary Assembly for Francophonie, so 93 countries and provinces around the world that are part of that. And so we are making legislation corpuses. So what that means is that we take the best legislation from each country and we try to implement them in the other countries to create a shared legislative space. Now, it takes a number of years, 4, 5, 10 years, and it involves a number of areas. We touch on climate. For instance, we created 9 legislative corpuses on climate, and now these sort of law kits are being promoted in all French-speaking countries, so the parliamentarians of those spaces can take on these laws and implement them. We're doing it, for instance, for whistleblowers, a specific status. We created it in France, a special status for whistleblowers. Now, this right is not upheld in many countries. Youman Faye, when president in Senegal was elected, the first laws that were to be passed in parliament when he was elected was to create a status to defend the rights of whistleblowers. So we worked on that together. For instance, sustainable mines. Can we extract mines differently, for instance, compared to practices implemented by China or Russia and Africa, for instance. So all of these questions, or Morocco, there's a very high level of protection for forests. So how can we copy that and replicate that in other countries? Because each country, has its own capacity and their own means, and they all have their for instance, their own legislation in place. But I don't want to take up all the time to give the floor to my colleague here from the United States. But I think it's important to mobilize citizens as well. And if citizens and civil society don't take the lead, then states won't do it. They won't contribute to improving human rights being upheld across the world. I'm going to hand the floor now to my colleague.
Merci, Bruno. And I think we'll come back.
Thank you, Bruno.
I know you have other examples which will also be able to kick us off a little bit more around some of the solutions and issues that we want to talk about in that vein. But Kelly, you might want to reflect a bit further on how we do engage differently in this moment with citizens in their spaces to really be recognizing, I think, with a bit of humility that we haven't delivered where we needed to deliver. So how do we reinvigorate that conversation?
Thanks. Yes. And a number of countries were raised that support and offer support for civil society and for human rights defenders. The United States is also one of those that provides grants for civil society that are under threat in their own countries. And it's something that's really important for us as well. I think, to your point, if we don't have the engagement of civil society, we're not going to be able to accomplish things in the multilateral space. Take something like the achievement of the SDGs as we drive towards that. Without civil society, without the private sector, we will not be achieving those goals. And it's critical that we have those voices at the table and that they are engaged and part of these discussions going forward. That's also why it's so important that we have civil society access to places like the UN. It's why the United States has pushed for NGOs to be accredited to the UN, to make sure that they can be participants in these conferences, to make sure that they can be engaged. And I think one other point that I would make is the importance of engaging young people and engaging youth. We had our third summit for democracy this year in South Korea, and the theme was focused on youth engagement and youth participation in democracy. And it's so important to hear from young people what they want, they have great ideas, and a lot of them are better than what we could even come up with. And so being able to listen to them, to hear and to integrate their ideas into what we're doing in the multilateral space, I think is something that's really important going forward.
Thanks, Kelly. And I think I'm going to abuse my position as chair for just a moment to say that we've been thinking a lot about this idea of genuinely inclusive multilateralism. And I think we're all really happy to see greater access of civil society to UN spaces and so on and so forth. But it's one thing to be invited into the room. It's another thing to be invited to rearrange the furniture. And I think that the next step that we really need to be taking when we're thinking about these sorts of reforms, and we are inviting civil society from various places to come, is it isn't just to come to tell your story and to go home, but to genuinely participate in the decisions that are being made around how you actually restructure these spaces so that they can be seen as being in the image of the citizens around the world that they're meant to serve. But I'll stop now. And if I may just go back, I'm going to go back in the opposite direction if I can, and just ask each of you to reflect a little bit on a space that is giving you hope, a space where you see different kind of conversations happening in terms of how you're advancing new conversations to advance human rights in different areas. And so, Kelly, I know you've got some interesting things to say specifically around some of the cybersecurity questions, so I'm going to turn over to you first.
Thanks so much, Meredith. And tomorrow, the UK and France are sponsoring a day to discuss the Pall Mall process, which focuses on technology and some of the misuses of technology and how that undermines human rights. When the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were drafting the declaration, I don't think they anticipated some of the things like commercial spyware that can be placed on an activist's or a journalist's phone and get access to all of their data. I talked to one journalist who told me that after commercial spyware was found on his phone, he was a pariah. Nobody wanted to speak to him. Nobody wanted to engage with him anymore, and it had a chilling effect and really undermined his human rights and undermined some of the fundamental principles around a free society that we want to have with journalists and others engaged. And so several countries have come together to look at this issue. the United States has put forward a joint statement on the misuse of commercial spyware and efforts to combat that. We have 21 signatories to that joint statement now. We held the first ever meeting of those countries on the margins of the UN General Assembly in New York this year. And we're working together to come up with solutions to address this problem. I think these are some of the threats that are new and emerging and are facing human rights defenders around the world, and it's something that we need to come together to collectively address. And so I'm glad to see, and I'm hopeful to see, that countries are coming together around some of these issues to come up with some solutions. And civil society has been a key part of exposing a lot of this. And so we've really worked in lockstep with civil society colleagues on this issue and really benefited from the research that they've done and all of the ideas they have for driving this forward.
Thanks, Kelly. And I think what I love about that is that it is a practical solution, but one that is directly impacting human rights defenders on the ground. And so good luck to you in those conversations coming up. Bruno, you've been reflecting a bit about the power of parliamentarians. You may not feel like you always have power, but the power of parliamentarians as elected representatives to be able to engage in these networks that you're describing in La Francophonie, to have these sorts of conversations and find new approaches to advancing human rights. So I was wondering if you maybe wanted to expand on some of those examples.
I'm going
to give you two examples in two different dimensions. So parliamentarians, MPs, represent people. Too often, parliamentarians are seen and themselves consider themselves as the sort of the advocates for the government, for the executive branch. You know, it's quite... And when parliamentarians believe that they're representative of the people, they sort of gain a lot more power. Now, it's really important for parliamentarians to have a voice at the table and to really be involved in non-profits as well. I created a parliament in my constituency, and so it's 150 people that vote on the laws that I myself vote on in parliament. So it's a sort of panel of representatives, and it gives me an idea of what my constituency feels like. I don't do this every 5 years. I do this every single week. So there's a constant dialogue, and so we exchange ideas, and it's a real participatory democracy that's really much stronger. For instance, if we were to have this in all constituencies, in all the world, then of course citizens would be questioned and asked for their opinion in real time. It wouldn't be every so often. It would be like on social media, it'll be engaging with content directly all day long. And so that is one example of citizen mobilization that I wanted to talk about. Next point, parliamentary diplomacy. So groups of parliamentarians need to be created to engage in democracy because sometimes countries are at odds with each other. For instance, in the Sahel, France and the Sahel countries. Sometimes countries are in conflict, but parliamentarians continue to engage in dialogue. Within the Committee for Francophonie, there's a joint declaration signed by MPs from Rwanda and the DRC. Now, it's not exactly a game changer, but it's the first time that they are coming together and signing a document together. So this can actually spur momentum for further action. Now, I don't want to take up too much time, but there are very many examples. Another, in Gabon and Guinea, again, countries cut ties, but MPs continue to engage in dialogue. India or Guinea, and there's a process to sort of support a junta to bring back constitutional order. That is actually human rights action. And, it's a way of trying to bring back democracy. And if you don't take that lead and take those initiatives, then other players will be there to take their own initiatives that will be much less scrupulous. Thank you.
Tricia, if I can ask you to maybe reflect a bit on, you've spoken really eloquently on some of the challenges that are being faced by human rights defenders and some of the failings that we have in the global system in this moment. What is giving you hope? What do you see as initiatives that are working, that need more support, where we can actually say, this is how we enable a genuine commitment to human rights and advancement of human rights in different places in which you're operating?
Well, what's primarily giving me hope is we are not holding forums to celebrate authoritarianism. There's no forum being held to celebrate the strongman or nationalism, right? We're still doubling down on the idea of democracy. Look, you cannot talk about human rights without a democratic framework. Without democracy, there is no human rights. So that in itself gives me incredible hope. The fact that, I've been very critical of India, of America, of the EU. Why? Because America is the motherland of democracy. Democracy was birthed there. India is the world's largest democracy. No one would have thought of the EU working as a project bound together with values of human rights and free and fair elections, but it is working. That in itself gives me incredible hope. I'll tell you what else gives me hope. When Russia invaded Ukraine, I went to Poland to serve in the humanitarian crisis centers. And what I saw were mothers getting out of vans, having left male members of their relatives behind in Ukraine, come with children, usually 2-3 kids. I saw teenagers hold their younger siblings' hands. I saw children push prams of infants. I saw children being forced to become adults and have to take care of people who are smaller than them, feed them, make sure that they were entertained. And what you saw in those humanitarian crisis centers were people laughing and reclaiming joy. So that inherently gives me hope, the fact that people are continuing to show up, even when institutions are failing them, even when there is finances going to support authoritarianism, there is incredible mettle in people who continue to show up. And till the time people continue to show up, I cannot lose hope.
Thank you.
Just last question about the freedom of press thing and spyware. I think it's important to mention Pegasus and sort of state-sponsored spyware. The reason I'm saying this is because one of the people Pegasus spied on was President Macron. The 10 Downing Street was spied on as well by UAE and India. So I think when you talk about spyware, we need to be very specific about who's funding the spyware. Because if heads of states are not safe, you can be rest assured human rights defenders are definitely not safe.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. The panelists have been wonderfully disciplined, so we do have time for a couple of questions from the audience. What I'd like to do, just to make sure that the panel will have a chance for a couple of final remarks, so we can take 1 or 2 questions, then I'll circle back to the full panel. We do have some microphones circulating, so if people can put a show of hands, if anyone has questions. I see one there. Start there. And you're waving at them, or you're waving at me? You're putting your hand up. Okay, great. So we've got 2, please.
Thank you very much. So my name is Lilia Twill. I'm French. I was born and raised in the French suburbs, and I've been actively involved in advocacy for human rights. And I wanted to let you know that spaces like this one are really powerful. They give hope for people like me. I was privileged to attend Yanga in New York, and I got many opportunities. While growing up, I did not believe that I could reach the spaces because I'm from a minority, I'm a woman, and I grew up in a hard neighborhood, but today I'm here, and that's hope. And what you said is powerful, so please, please, keep spreading hope, keep sharing your story, and keep speaking up, because your voice is important, so thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much to the panelists. Je me permets de parler en français parce que je
I'm going to be speaking in French because I'm talking to Mr. Fuchs especially. So we talked about commercial spyware. So I work on this particular question closely. And there's a vast opportunity now for legislation in democratic countries, even developing countries, to pass laws in order to to contain the risk of this spyware being used in democracies. So, Mr. Fuchs, an idea. Why not work with your American counterparts and civil society to look at laws and acts that could actually limit the risks of this spyware in democracies? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more if you can be brief, and then we'll circle back, if that's okay. Thank you.
C'est bon. Tout le monde m'entend? OK.
Can you hear me? I'm going to also speak French. So I am from Tunisia. I'm living in France. I am a human rights activist in Tunisia. And human rights in Tunisia are under threat. Now, you've talked a lot about hope, and I think that this type of event, as was said earlier, this is also a source of hope. But how can we give hope to, for instance, the opposition and human rights activists in Tunisia that are now hopeless? Their hope has gone. If you speak out, you end up in jail in Tunisia. How do we continue to motivate and keep this flame alive in Tunisia? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, merci. It's such an important point, I think, to close on, is that we cannot ever shy away from the depth of the challenges that are being faced every day. As Jane Goodall said recently, hope requires action. We have to feel that we can act, and when situations are as closed as you described, that really does shut down these spaces and constrains the extraordinary citizen mobilization that I think all of our panelists have been pointing to. So I'll ask each of you to maybe conclude with a couple of closing thoughts. I'm going to mix it up a little bit. Trisha, I'll start with you.
Thank you for that question, and I'm sorry for what your country is going through. In French, we say on lâche rien, en fait. You know, you let go of nothing. Where does my hope come from? My hope comes from huge organizations like OSF, like OGP, that are putting the money where the mouth is. The truth is, discrimination is not accidental. Right? Violence is not accidental. There's a lot of money going behind funding these inequitable violent spaces. And when you see organizations that are saying, actually, we will defend democracy and we will put our money where our mouth is, I draw incredible hope from that, from leadership that's willing to call an authoritarian fascist leader an authoritarian fascist leader. You have to pinpoint the tail of the donkey, you know? And that sort of leadership gives me incredible hope. My hope comes from President Macron, who the first year we launched Paris Peace Forum said nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism. My hope comes from the incredible activists on ground. It's been 4 years since an activist in India has been jailed. His name is Umar Khalid. And there's incredible guilt that I carry when I'm in these spaces trying to figure out what is my space here. But I'll tell you, every time he's out in public, he's smiling. He refuses to let the government see his spirit broken. And he constantly says, on lâche rien, we do not let go. Because you know the cost you pay when you let go and you stop fighting. So you don't fight to win. You fight because you must fight. So forget about fighting because you're assured this utopian fairyland at the end of it. No, we fight because our existence matters, and the fight in itself needs to be fought.
Trisha, thank you. I was with some Sudanese activists at the margins of Anga, and there was a number of Sudanese that were not able to get there. They weren't able to get the visas, and several of them were saying, I'm here because they can't be. And it's my responsibility, therefore, to be speaking in these spaces and to continue these messages. Kelly, I may turn to you, and I'm going to give Bruno, since he had one direct question, I'm going to give him 1 more minute to think about it, and then I'll give you the last word. Kelly.
Thank you so much. Well, it's very clear that we have a lot of human rights defenders and activists here in this room, and that gives me hope. There are so many challenges, and we've talked about so many different countries today and so many different places. But what gives me hope is that I know that the people in this room are committed to taking these things forward and to carrying that forward. And I've learned a lot from the panel today and from all of you as well. And those are things that I'll carry with me as well.
Kelly, thank you. Bruno, you get the last word.
Je rejoins
Yes, I think that this ability to mobilize hope. Now, in some cases, authoritarians have completely captured an entire state. You know, Cuba has been trying for years and decades now to try to free themselves. So, of course, it does take time. Something that was mentioned that seems absolutely essential to me in terms of destabilization is spyware, but also social networks. And so this direct expression of democracy on social media. For instance, the government in Australia wants to block access to under 18s. If there's not swift legislation on social media, then violence, discrimination, trolls will win and will prevail over reasoning and objective thinking, compromise and respecting other people's identities, opinions. So I think that a big challenge is social media. A lot is at stake because all values are being put against each other in that forum. And so policymakers, state leaders need to take action quickly. For instance, in Côte d'Ivoire, there are 2 election codes that have been passed to try to stem the power of social media during elections. So that's a number of examples. But when we come together in high numbers, it's important, beyond history, beyond culture, is to remind ourselves that we have the same ambition and we want the same world for the future and for future generations. And that's what makes us strong. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for staying. A huge round of applause for our panelists. I know this is an issue that concerns the forum organizers and all of you on a daily basis. And I know this conversation will continue in all of your spaces. So thank you for spending the time with us today. Merci.